On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
I'd like to welcome to the podcast today Ben Locwin. Ben Locwin is a healthcare executive and has worked in pharma and medical device for over 20 years. And this work has included bringing Lean and Six Sigma methods into the industry. His work also spanned into their other industries, including food and beverage, aerospace, petrochemical, and energy. He's worked on global methods for risk management, which also found their way into ICH Q9. He's been working on the COVID-19 pandemic on various state and federal task forces for public health. I'd like to welcome to the show Ben Locwin. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Don. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much. And so I've been, doing a lot of reading of quite a few of your articles. And I just recently picked up Pharmaceutical Online titled, you have an article in there titled, Use These 7 Tools for Breakthrough Quality and Performance in 30 Days. You cover how organizations can use the following tools. And I'd like to just dive a little bit deeper into each one of them, if that'd be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So the check sheet is the first thing that comes up on the list. You show an example of somebody using it more or less, it looks like for paint job quality in the article. So just can we talk a little bit about that and what would we use it for?
Yeah. So the check sheet itself as a tool has been around for literally thousands of years. It's simply a tally of something. So the ancient Egyptians used them for tallying weights and measures, charges, inventory, and so forth. And if you can imagine, as far back as civilization has had recorded history, the cradle of humanity at the outset was the Sumerians, where writing derived. And they use a form of writing called cuneiform, but they also had left behind things that look to us a lot like check sheets. And the idea is you're just basically tallying something. And in a problem-solving usage, a check sheet tallies errors typically. So for example, you would maybe face the question down of how many errors are coming from a particular step in a batch record, or a QA review of documents is finding how many of certain types of errors. And these can then be used as primary evidence to inform process improvements. So there's a difference between primary and secondary and tertiary evidence. And essentially what you're doing with primary evidence is trying to collect it from the source. So instead of hearsay, you're actually looking through, let's say, documents, or you're categorizing equipment failures. And every time there's a particular failure mode, you would tally it on the check sheet. And so now you've got a collection of witnessed, observed primary evidence from which you can design process improvements. Yeah, in the article, that was a real example about paint failures in automotive. I had done some work in aerospace and automotive on a lot of different types of failures and process improvements. So that was derived from one of those. But it's a very, to me, very basic and very important tool. And I think a lot of people don't use the check sheet because it seems so basic. It's, something, oh yeah, of course, we know there are 7 errors in the past month, or we know there's a lot, it's dozens. Well, how do you know there's a lot and that there are dozens unless you actually tally? And maybe you find out that your mental model is off by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4, and it's much higher than you really believed it to be. And then, by the way, when you put into place your improvements, how do you know you got better unless you can tally again and demonstrate to yourself the after, which is following the before? And ultimately, if you're trying to put into place in the industry CAPA, which is a corrective action or preventive action, you really, for crit issues of high severity, should have an effectiveness check. And that is essentially demonstrating to your organization, and ultimately is a discoverable document for the FDA and other regulatory agencies, that you demonstrated a change and improvement. And how do you demonstrate improvement unless you measure? Maybe you had 17 some things at the beginning and the before, and then afterwards it's 3. And 17 is a lot different than 3, depending on, what it is. That could be a tremendous amount of process improvement or cost savings, error reduction, patient safety, et cetera. So unless you measure, you don't know.
So do you really look at the check sheet as a fundamental first thing that you should do, or can it fall anywhere in the process?
I think it's a nice one first thing, like I said, to try to get a handle on where things are. Sometimes an immediate review of the process or failures may not lend itself to something like a check sheet, and it may just be later as you're digging into the investigation, one of the branches within which you would dive might lead you to say, oh, how often is this thing failing? This is branch number 4 out of 7. And down that branch of thinking, like in a fault tree, as you go down the different levels, you say, we don't know. We've never really categorized it. Okay, so you could use a check sheet as a nested tool in that example, as well as a fault tree or a fishbone or any other kind of tools. But the idea is if there's anywhere you need to tally something, then the check sheet's a good approach.
Okay. All right. And second on the list is a flow chart. So you have the flow chart example in your article as well, fairly simple example, but to just walk us through the importance that you think a flow chart brings to the 7 tools.
Yeah, the flowchart is an interesting one. There are more companies whose standard operating procedures are becoming visual these days relative to any other time in the past, where SOPs were always attempted to be fully laden down with text, impenetrable levels of text. W. Edwards Deming, who was a famous process improvement engineer, from which a lot of the thinking about management and process controls derived from, he said that if you can't define what you're doing as a process, then you don't know what you're doing. And this is totally true. And more often than not, much more often than not, in fact, I find that people can't really conceptualize their work as a series of repeatable steps. So they have a hard time just taking their day job and turning it into a process flowchart. Unless you're calibrated to it, like you've been through a project management course or certification program, or use flowcharts a lot for some reason, features of your work, people don't think in flow diagrams. But once you've been calibrated to it, creating reproducibility of processes by process flowcharts allows everyone to get on the same page and to understand their processes together. In Lean, we have a phrase that goes, see as a group, know as a group, and act as a group. So getting everyone to think about the same mental models goes a long way in making outcomes much more consistent. And so it's not ad hoc every time, and not ad hoc every time somebody new participates in the process. They can see this is step 1, then 2, then 3, then, oh, there's a decision here. How do I make that decision? I don't know. Where do I find out the answer to that? And then which branch do I take from that decision node? And so then pretty much everybody will more or less come to the same sorts of outcomes and conclusions in the process. And if you're not getting to the same outcomes and conclusions, then why even tell yourself that you have a process? Essentially, all you're doing is randomness.
And being able to write it down and just make it more visual seems to be something that isn't common sense, but at the same time, after somebody sees a flow diagram and sees a disconnect in a process, it allows that ability for additional conversation potentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Because again, everyone is using the same mental model, then they're seeing as a group, knowing as a group, and can then act as a group. You're looking at step 3 in the meeting and you're the facilitator, and everyone sees what step 3 is, what came before it as the antecedent, what comes after it, and they can say, no, that's not how we do it. And it get reviewed first by, okay, that doesn't exist on here. Where do we put in the review by?
Let's go to number 3. So tool number 3 was a cause and effect or fishbone diagram. As a Six Sigma black belt, this is one of my number 1 tools that I frequently would use to troubleshoot problems. So let's talk a little bit about the cause and effect diagram.
Yeah, I often refer to this, including in the article that you mentioned of mine, as the Ishikawa diagram. And it's not just me. I do it to give proper deference to its creator, whose name was Kaoru Ishikawa. And whether you call it a cause and effect diagram, a fishbone diagram, Ishikawa diagram, all means the same thing. And probably most listeners have seen a fishbone diagram. But importantly, it's required in my mind that they actually create one. So as much as people may have seen them and say, yeah, I've seen a fishbone diagram 1,000 times, if you've not actually had to facilitate a meeting or try to get people on the same page as you with one, it's very different. So many times I've seen people who've been through trainings on all kinds of process improvement tools and techniques, but then when you hand somebody an expo marker at the whiteboard and say, please facilitate this group, they just can't effectively create a fishbone diagram in front of the group. And let's say nerves aside, it's because they never really understood it on a deeper level. So suspending disbelief, the structure is supposed to mimic the skeleton of a fish, where at the head is a robust problem statement. And then the ribs are the causal categories. And so those include man, material, method, machine, mother nature, and measurement, typically. Doesn't have to. You could also do it by process steps. So if you think back to the process flow map that we just talked about, you could have steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the process, 8, 9, 10, however many. It gets unwieldy after a while, but if you have a handful of steps, you could say, okay, which of these steps is most likely to contribute to these effects that we're seeing, these untoward effects and defects or deviations or process failures. But those basic categories encapsulate most of any causal factor for a process going wrong. So for example, under machine, you might list how many relevant ways could the process equipment lead to the defect or the deviation that you're investigating. And so you would list all of those out, and then you can always rank or assign probabilities to it later, or maybe if there's just a few, you can spend all your investigative time trying to uncover and unpack the details behind each of those causal factors and see which ones are really related to the effects. So that's also why it's called a cause and effect diagram. So you look at the causes, the causal factors to the defect, and you try to assess which causes lead to the effect.
Putting a little bit of data behind that is what the next two more or less focus on. So histogram is the next one. Let's talk a little bit about histogram and the 7 tools.
Yeah, histograms are an interesting one. I enjoy plotting data depending on what type they are as a histogram. It's always good to plot your data to be able to see the architecture and the structure of what's going on visually. Tables are nice for assimilating large number sets, but to see relationships visually, they really need to be plotted. Histograms are named from the Latin word histos, which means mast, as in the mast of a ship. So the bars of a histogram, and you could say this of a bar chart too, but because the bars look like ship masts, histogram is a chart of masts. Now, it's essentially an approximate representation of the distribution of numerical data, and the philosopher statistician Carl Pearson is the one who came up with it. The idea is with a histogram, you first need to bin your range of values. So you've got some collection of data, and then you want to divide the entire range into series of intervals. And then you have these bins, which are consecutive and non-overlapping intervals of variable, and they're laid out adjacently. So what you have is this bar chart, which is giving you the shape of the distribution then of your data. And what's interesting about the histogram is it's showing you if you've got a single mode in your data, or maybe it's a bimodal distribution. You can see if it's left skewed or right skewed. You can try to infer some sort of relationship from that, maybe a bimodal distribution, so meaning you have 2 humps. That might be pointing to the fact that you've got 2 different worker shifts that are participating, and maybe the first hump in the data is related to shift A and the second hump is shift B or vice versa. And you can ask yourself the question of why is the centering of each shift's resultant outputs different between the two shifts? Are they running the machines differently? Are they doing their personnel procedures differently between the shifts? And then try to divine out some causality therein.
Great. That's fantastic. And then in terms of practical examples, typically you see the data collected in a spreadsheet first and then put into some sort of statistical tool, or how have you seen this done in the past?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, certainly in the old days, it was done with graph paper and basically a list of numbers. You would record values and then you would just create the histogram almost like from a frequency distribution first, where you almost have stacked dots to represent each individual value, and then clean it up and make a histogram where you're stacking bars and recreating intervals. But the idea is these days, it's obviously convenient to do it in Excel. My caution in Excel is for the most part, it's not validated. And not that collecting data in something like Minitab or Jump or Statistica is either, but it is at least a little bit more difficult to manipulate and move around your string of numbers in a tool, let's say Minitab's data capture. So sometimes I'll just have the team, or I'll plot the data directly into Minitab, and then once I have a column of numbers, I can quickly produce a histogram. Of course, if you're capturing it in Excel, you just want to make sure you're not shuffling and sorting things around with filtering and auto sorts and things, which get messy, and that's really where the risk is. But anyway, from there, you could create something of you could basically fake out a histogram in Excel by creating intervals and then making a bar chart from your numbers. But all the stat packages are designed with baked-in histogram as a function, so you can do it very quickly. What you could do is have the team just collect an Excel, pass it on to somebody who has a statistical package, and they can just paste the column of data into whatever package they're using, and then click histogram, select some particulars and values, and then let it run, and it'll give you an instant output.
Great. Thank you. The next one in the list is a Pareto chart.
Yeah, the Pareto chart's an interesting one. I'm a big fan of looking for Pareto relationships. So these refer to the 80-20 rule. And in a lot of business management texts, they talk about the law of 80-20 or the 80-20 rule. And that essentially means that 80% of effects come from 20% of causes. And it doesn't always hold true, as you can imagine, but it holds true quite a bit. And if it's not 80-20, maybe it's 70-30. Interestingly, though, the two numbers don't have to add up to 100. So you can give that some thought later, and the listeners as well. But you could have a 90-40 relationship. And what that means is 90% of the effects, let's say, are coming from 40% of the causes. So it doesn't have to be a 90-10 or a 95-5. It's basically saying a small number of something is leading to a disproportionately large amount of something else. And the Pareto chart was named from Vilfredo Pareto. He was an Italian economist, and in the 1800s, he was plotting relationships like this, like between wealth and population, and finding, for example, that perhaps 80% of the wealth in Italy at the time was controlled by 20% of the people. And so these are what we call Pareto relationships, or there's a Pareto zip law. And the idea is that, again, there are the small somethings that are disproportionately contributing to the larger something else's. And we still see that in every economy across the globe. And that tends to be something that we've seen in lots of industries, in manufacturing and neuroscience and aerospace and food and beverage. There are all kinds of Pareto relationships. And so the Pareto chart is a great way of seeing those very few somethings, the critical few, which are contributing to a large number of effects.
Great. And the next one up on the list is the control chart. And again, it seems like the application on the control chart falls strongly back to, one, having the data, but two, having a statistical package of some sort to be able to plot this out as well. Is that how you've seen this implemented before?
Yeah, certainly in the 1920s and 30s and beyond, the control charts were plotted by hand. There are lots of great old examples of some of Stewart's original control charts and many others since then, where at Bell Labs and other places, they would hand draw control charts, hand drawn upper and lower control limits, hand drawn X bar through the middle, which is the average of the data sample. And so you could create what's in effect a control chart, again, in Excel as a quick tool to use, where basically it would be plotting a trend typically over time where you've got some max and min values in there, and then you would have to calculate your upper and lower control limits in order to put those in as horizontal lines, and then calculate a data average in order to put in your sample mean across the middle of the bouncing data values. But yes, certainly any statistical process control software has a very robust approach to control charting and has all different types of control charts like X-bar charts, IMR charts, and depending on what type of data you are using, you can find somebody who's expert at putting together control charts so you don't choose the wrong chart type, which could lead you to have incorrectly derived control limits. But essentially, the idea is you want to look for what Walter Stewart, who created the control chart in 1924, would have called the critical few versus the trivial many. The idea is that you've got common cause issue and variation, and you have special cause issues and variation. The company's engineers at the time where Stewart worked had been trying to improve the reliability of telephone transmission systems. And a lot of the equipment that they had was buried underground. And so in order to reduce the frequency of failures and repairs, they had begun to understood that reducing their process variation in manufacturing had a big impact on reliability. And more interesting, and this came out empirically just by trial and error, the engineers found that continuously adjusting their process in reaction to nonconformances and deviations, so in other words, interfering with a process very consistently, actually increases variation and degrades quality. And looking at this idea of common and special cause variation, Walter Stewart wrote this internal memo and introduced the idea of the control chart as a tool to distinguish between what you should expect as common variation. This is what we call common cause variation now. So the typical process bounce just due to natural variation versus what sorts of issues are coming from what's called special cause variation now, which are these things that are statistically unlikely. So they're not part of the day-to-day natural process and variation, but instead are these more pronounced signals. So it's not only that they spike up or down, but also there are statistical trends to look out for and shifts in the data, which may tell you things about production lines changing or something in the reliability decaying. And so these early warning signals are really what these can help you pick out and improve your process.
Thank you for that. That's a great explanation. And scatter plots are the last one on the list.
Yeah, scatter plots. So these are typically called like an XY or correlation plot. It's a mathematical plot which uses Cartesian coordinates. So you got an XY axis and you've got two variables for a set of data. There's a collection of points, and generally speaking, you've got, if there's a parameter that's incremented or decremented, so increases or decreases by virtue of the other parameter, then that one's called the control parameter, or it's the independent variable. I'll use that terminology. So you put the independent variable customarily on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. And then your measured or dependent variable, you're on the y-axis, the vertical axis. And sometimes you don't really maybe have an independent versus dependent set of variables, but even in that case, you can do a scatter plot to show the degree of correlation between two variables, so x versus y, whatever your x's and y are. I think that the important takeaway when people make scatter plots is they're looking at R values, which is the regression correlation coefficient, then you also have the R-square valued, which is the coefficient of correlation. And the idea is when you're looking at the data plotted, especially within software, because Excel will do some of this too. If you're doing an XY plot, so you have a column of X values, let's say, and a column of Y values, you can do an XY scatter plot in Excel and it'll throw in a fit line and you can, all right, so I guess my caution, without going into too much detail, is overfitting models. So selecting very high order polynomials can lead you to fake conclusions about your data and the provenance of your data and the accuracy of your model because you have too many degrees of freedom. And then I think if you're using a statistical package for this and you plot two variables that may or may not be actually causally related, you may see a strong correlation. And my caveat with these always is to make sure that you're not taking the degree of correlation to bespeak the causality between two variables. So there's a lot written on this, and shark attacks and ice cream in the summertime, et cetera. But the idea is if you have two variables and they're strongly correlated, it does not mean that one affects the other or vice versa. So you can take the correlation for what it is, that there seems to be some association, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're causally related, but a very powerful tool nonetheless. An example could be something like, you could plot something like number of pages in a batch record, let's say. So one of your variables is a number of pages or number of steps, basically talking about complexity. And then you might have number of errors in that particular record, document, or batch record. And so you want to ask yourself the question, is there a relationship between the complexity of a document as measured by too many process steps or too many signature spots or data values or too many pages? And then is that correlated with number of errors? So increasing numbers of steps in a record, do we see growing numbers of errors in those records? And you might say, yeah, we sure do. It might be apparent because with more steps comes potentially more errors. And it could just be by virtue of, it could be randomness, number one. It could be because the records are too data and information dense and it's hard to follow. But the idea is this doesn't necessarily give you the causality, but it certainly gives you some interesting things to look at and where to bring your investigation to next.
It's an excellent point that you can't use data without observation. It has to be used simultaneously is what I'd take away from that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Okay, and so one last question related to the article. So as organizations look at the 7 tools, you say that they have breakthrough capabilities for quality and performance in a 30-day period. As they look to implement these, are you recommending that organizations look at adding all of these or some of these, or specifically pick out issues that they're seeing and then apply these 7 tools against them?
You know, that's a great question. Sometimes the organizations may not know what issues they have until they use one or more of the tools. And then the structured thinking of the tools can help them identify where their issues are, where they may not have known. It could be the next part, maybe they haven't used many or any of these tools before. So to leave it up to, let's say, the reader or listener, where they say, all right, this one looks interesting, I'll use this tool or this tool. It may not be the appropriate tool. And if they don't have training, they may not be picking the right tool for the right problem. And the right tool at the wrong time is the wrong tool. Knowing which tool to use when matters because the tools lend themselves to different types of data analysis. So I would say you can use all 7 tools, not really simultaneously, sometimes together, but oftentimes in sequence, as we've discussed. You may find that using 3 of the tools gives you the output you need, but it requires practice and deeply understanding what value these tools can provide to you so that you can fit them in appropriately within your investigation. I would say on the nature of there being 7 tools, for the last, 5 or 10 years, a lot of clickbait articles on the internet have been like the 7 reasons why traveling on airplanes is worse than on a train or something. And they always pick some random number, like the 4 reasons relationships fail. There's never 4 or 7 or 12, or that's, like I said, just it makes people curious. And so those article types have led to a lot of people pursuing them, clicking on them, and that drives metrics. The reason why there are 7 tools here comes down to what happened in post-war Japan. There was this fellow named Saito Benkei, and he had these 7 famous weapons. And so anyways, this fellow lived between 1155 and 1189, and he was a warrior monk. And in a lot of the ancient Japanese writings about him, there was a lot that carried forward to kind of post-war Japan. And the thinking goes that it was Kaoru Ishikawa who again created the fishbone diagram, who was influenced by Benkei, this Japanese warrior monk. And also that he was influenced by W. Edwards Deming, again, who had given lectures to Japanese engineers and scientists in post-war Japan in 1950. And so at the time, companies had set about training their workforce in statistical quality control to try to get ahead of the rest of the world. And they found that the complexity of the subject was so intimidating to workers and trainees that they wanted to focus on simpler methods. And in so doing, they thought back to Benkei, of course, and he had these 7 famous weapons. So the number 7 was essentially chosen as that for the 7 basic tools. And the Project Management Institute as well uses some form of 7 tools. I don't think it's all of these that I chose in their body of knowledge for project management, but the idea is using the right tool at the right time matters the most. And there's 7 tools for a mostly apocryphal and philosophical reason, and not for much other reason other than picking a number is better than having no number.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. And so we're down to the last 3 questions in the show that I really like to try and ask everybody. First in the list is, what inspires you?
I think improving patients' lives through reductions in morbidity and mortality, and improving how patients feel, function, and survive. And that's across the general public. I think the more we can help people to feel, function, and survive better in society makes all of our lives better. And we'll eventually, if we're not already, we'll all be patients one day. So that also reflects positively on all of us.
And what concerns you?
That people still believe so strongly that dark matter exists. Could be a simple cosmological modeling error. Maybe also, for now, that the current pandemic, people don't think masks work to attenuate the spread of respiratory pathogens. So right now I'm tied between dark matter and mask use.
Interesting correlation. And lastly, what excites you?
Excitatory pre- and post-synaptic potentials. That's the neurobiology of excitement in every creature, and especially in every vertebrate. It works the same way. So we all get excited for the same neurological reasons. I don't know. It's been an interesting year as we are winding down 2020. I would say finding interesting ways to participate on various task forces for COVID-19 in different states and nationwide has been exciting and interesting. And at the same time, besides rewarding, it's been a little humbling. There are some great expertises out there who have also been a part, and it's learning from others and also seeing kind of the toll that's being taken on society is something that I think we still need to talk about. But yeah, like I said, I think there's been a lot of excitement, though, this year in terms of pushing forward for greater scientific truth. And that's certainly apparent every day to all of us amid COVID-19. The James Webb Telescope continues to prepare for launch. And I mean, there are so many other reasons why I'm excited about where we're heading as a civilization for the future. And of course, there are always blips and bumps in the road, but we're getting there, wherever there is.
I do greatly enjoy hearing how different individuals answer those 3 questions. And certainly your work with the COVID task force certainly is a great thing to just be proud of your activity there as well. It's important work that has to happen. Also, who knows, maybe we learn some key lessons that we ensure don't repeat themselves in the next pandemic. So with that, Ben Locwin, I wanted to thank you for being a guest and for providing all these great tools. I would encourage anybody that listens to this podcast to also take a little bit of time and research some of the other articles that Ben is out there on the internet. And with that, thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.